This is the first few pages of my latest ghost novel. Please take a listen. I hope you like it. The video is just something to keep your eyes busy. It doesn't really have any relevance to the story. Okay, here we go. Heading north. 2 motorcycles, 3 riders, heading north up the Trans-Canada Highway. Lake Superior to the west, granite cliffs and forest stretching endlessly to the east. The glint of the morning sun off the water, and trees, cobble beaches, rock headlands, and more trees. The sound of the engines loud between rock cuts, then eerily swallowed by the crowding forest. Patches of snow lingering deep in the shadows. The air warm in the sun, but cool close to the lake. Superior never really warms. It may look inviting, but it's deadly. Steve Dawson reached his clutch hand back, giving his passenger's thigh a gentle squeeze. His thoughts straying briefly away from the mysterious stone cliff skull, which had been on his mind, to more congenial and immediate topics. His touch was returned by warm hands on his thighs and a gentle knee squeeze. Subtle pressure, which promised closer and more affectionate contact later. 100 yards back, a hulking figure on a large black machine matched their pace. The miles rolled by. At Wawa, the road left the lakeshore, heading inland in an immense loop around the vastness of Pukasar National Park, gradually trending west past White River, only regaining the lakeshore 100 miles later at Marathon. The 2 motorcycles travelled on, past spruce, pine, birch and poplar, past rock, lake and river, and trees, always more trees. Steve's mind drifted back to thinking about that skull. It was out of place, an anomaly, an enigma. Who would bury a human skull on its own, and why? And where was the rest of the body? They had a grid reference, a few days at their disposal, their motorbikes, and the desire to find out. Spring 1779. Charles Janvier, the murderer and cannibal, was dead, shot through the head by Mr. Fulton. Yet Louis Dufresne was terrified. He'd seen the other men casting hostile glances his way, muttering to one another across the smoky fire when they thought he wasn't looking. He'd noticed the sour looks from the native traders and heard the quiet words they spoke, their tomahawks gleaming on their belts as they exchanged the winter's harvest of pelts and smoked meat for shot, powder, and rum. He was shunned, despised, avoided. He clung to his bunk in the dark cabin, avoiding all contact. His God, who has always been such a source of comfort and strength, always present and only just out of reach, had deserted him. No solace came to him by mouthing prayers and fingering his rosary. No peace descended in answer to his fervid entreaties. But more than the isolation, the unfriendly and venomous looks, and the alienation from his God, he feared the growing emptiness, the aching hunger, the painful craving in his mind that no ordinary food could assuage. He too had partaken of Janvier's ghastly feasts. The men knew it. They feared him. During the previous winter, facing starvation, the men at Mr. Fulton's trading post on Shikakistagoan Lake had split up to eke out the winter as best they could. Louis Dufresne, Charles Janvier, and François Saint-Onge had travelled for 3 days to reach Barnabas Johnson's old cabin further down the river. Fishing and hunting proved futile. As days turned to weeks and their few scraps of food were exhausted, their bodies became shriveled and drawn, their muscles wasted. Their skin hung in folds. The weather was cruelly cold. Ice lined the walls of the tiny cabin, despite the central fire, which burned night and day. Snow was feet deep outside. Then salvation arrived in the form of Kikik, a passing Ojibwe traveller who'd seen the smoke rising from Johnson's cabin. He had food which he gladly shared in exchange for a warm bed by their fire. But Charles Janvier killed him with an axe, butchered him, and forced Louis and Francois to eat his flesh. In their desperation, and to their eternal regret, they hadn't taken much persuasion once the smell of cooking meat filled the cabin. Eventually Kikik was fully consumed, and soon after their hunger returned, more powerfully than before. Francois Saint-Ange, being the largest of the three, had weathered starvation slightly better than Charles or Louis. At least Francois had the strength to climb from his bed to retrieve wood for the fire. But on his return, Charles Janvier buried the axe blade deep in his neck and sliced him apart. Louis was horrified. Already fearful that his soul would be cast into hell, he was now terrified that, unless he followed Janvier's demands, he too would end up butchered and cooked. And yet, the smell of Francois's fat dripping into the hot coals, the sight of the flames searing the skin to crackling, the sizzle of the marrow oozing from the cut rib ends, proved too intoxicating to ignore. By the time the last fragments of Francois had been eaten and the bones of their two victims crushed, burned and buried, the fishing had improved and spring was on its way. Janvier made Louis swear on his crucifix that Francois had gone hunting with a native who appeared at the door. They returned to Mr. Fulton's. The men were immediately suspicious. Under Mr. Fulton's careful and clever interrogation, Louis admitted the horrible truth, and Charles Janvier was executed. But while Louis had described himself as a victim of Janvier's evil bullying, the men remained distrustful and angry. They knew that he too was a cannibal, and a cannibal in their midst could not be endured. It was only a matter of time. Late summer, 2022. So when were you going to tell me you'd bought a bike? Steve Dawson looked accusingly over at Theo, who was doing his best to keep his head down while he sorted through the tray of 500-year-old pottery sherds on his desk. I didn't even know you got a license, let alone that you've been hiding a bike from me. Whatever other secrets have you been keeping? I'm not quite ready to show you, Theo responded without looking up. I guess it was Monica who let the cat out of the bag. She saw me sneaking some parts out of the office that I'd had delivered here. Now you know, I guess I better tell you what I've been up to. Do you remember seeing all those riders while we were on our way back from our adventures in Northern Ontario last year? That got me excited to ride again. Mention of that trip instantly brought unwelcome memories flooding into Steve's mind. On 2 previous occasions, in the course of their archaeological work, Steve and Theo had unexpectedly encountered spirits from an earlier time. At Holliford Lake, they'd come in contact with 2 benign, ephemeral beings, Mary and Scunionsa, who were trapped in time between existence and non-existence, and who'd needed a little help to be able to find peace. This was their first experience with beings from a different dimension, and they both had hoped it would be their last. Sadly for them, this was not the case. Encountering Mary and Scunionsa had unlocked something in their minds. They could now see ghosts, and the ghosts knew it. The ghost of Charles Janvier, murderer and cannibal, whom they'd encountered during some work on Lac La Morte in remote northwestern Ontario, still haunted Steve's dreams. Janvier had been far too solid, too capable, too consumed by restless hunger. An intimidating and relentless force whom, after a series of horrifying events, they'd finally been able to help to find some permanent peace. Pushing these unwelcome thoughts from his mind, Steve looked over at Theo. The skin of Theo's scalp was visible through his fine, wispy blonde hair, which was fighting a losing battle with time. His broad, powerful shoulders seemed oddly out of place hunched over the delicate artifacts, as his fingers carefully sorted the decorated sherds into small piles based on the design and type of decoration. "Spill the beans, Theo. What have you got?" Steve Dawson was a bike geek. His passion was for older Italian motorbikes, but he was interested in anything with a motor and two wheels. "Wait, let me guess." He looked at Theo again. Short and stocky. He'd have difficulty getting a leg over any of the tall, modern adventure-style bikes so popular these days. It would have to be something with a low saddle height. A cruiser, then. "Don't tell me you bought a Harley. Was that a coal scuttle helmet you were having delivered? Shall I buy you some tassels for the handlebar ends?" he laughed, as a look of horror passed over Theo's face. "No, not a Harley. You'll just have to wait and see." "I got to run out to the post office in a few minutes. Perhaps I'll drop by your house and take a peek. I know you leave the garage unlocked," Steve taunted. During their years working together, the two men had got to know each other's strengths and weaknesses. And one of Theo's weaknesses was that he could easily be badgered into going along with other people's wishes, as long as it wasn't something important. If it was, he was immovable as a rock. Theo's problem was that while he was eager to show Steve his new bike, he'd intended to surprise him by arriving at work on it one day. Now, thanks to Monica, his plan was busted. All right. Give me a ride home after work and I'll show you. But no more prying questions. I want there to be some mystery and surprise." A few hours later, Steve left his office and headed down to the lab where Theo was working. "Okay, Theo, that's it for today. Let's go and see that bike of yours," he said, pulling on his jacket. "Trying to imagine what you've got hiding in the garage has been plaguing me all day, but I don't have a clue. Since you've obviously got a license, I assume you've had bikes in the past. At least you can tell me about those as we go." Theo turned off the computer he'd been using to enter the pottery data, stood up and grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. As they walked out to Steve's truck, he said, "I had a Yamaha Virago for a while. Loved that engine, and the low seat height suited me. But the ergonomics were brutal. After a 100-mile ride, I'd be popping Robaxacet for a week." By the time they arrived at Theo's house, he'd given Steve a full rundown of all the bikes he'd owned, the last one having been sold a few years before they met, although he didn't explain why. "It was a grey BMW K100. A bit tall for me, so I had to watch it when coming to a stop, but it was an outstanding long-distance tourer. Super relaxed on the highway, and plenty fast enough for me." "So all this was before you started working for us," said Steve. "You can't imagine how enviously I've looked at you when you've turned up on your bike. It's an ache that never goes away." They pulled into Theo's driveway, got out, and crunched up the gravel to his garage. "Are you ready for this, Steve?" he asked. "It's probably not what you've been expecting." Theo pushed on the overhead door, which rolled up easily. It was dark inside, just a jumble of miscellaneous shapes, until he switched on the light. Steve instantly noticed the fat, dual-sport front tire, the small headlight with protective steel mesh, and the rubber gaiters on the chromed forks. Then his eye took in the huge cylinders jutting out to either side and the hulking mass of the motorcycle. "So what do you think?" asked Theo. "It's fabulous," replied Steve. "I've never seen a Goldwing Scrambler before. Does it go as well as it looks?" "I haven't taken it far yet, because I've only just finished it, but it seems to handle well." Steve walked around admiring. The flat, chromed handlebars and elegant instruments in their polished aluminum surround were unlike anything that had graced a factory Goldwing. The engine cases and carburetor manifolds were polished, but the rest of the bike, the frame, faux tank, side panels and wheels, were all finished in flat black paint. "Incredible work, Theo. What was the original bike?" "It started life as a 1980 Goldwing Interstate 1100. Originally, I'd intended to keep it close to standard. But the fairing and panniers had been damaged in a drop, so I decided to junk all that heavy touring stuff and make a bike that was as light and easy to handle as possible, while retaining all that flat fore goodness. By the time I'd pulled off the fairing, the top box, the panniers, the pannier frames, the radio, the CB, the compressor, and all the wiring and sensors that went with it, it must have shed almost 200 pounds. Mind if I have a sit? No problem. Steve swung his leg over and settled down onto the single tractor-style leather seat. A small, blacked-out luggage rack now occupied the passenger seat area. A single seat allowed me to lower the seat height a little so I can reach the ground, but I can see that for you it would be a bit cramped. I added the rack for longer trips. My soft panniers and waterproof duffel fit perfectly. Steve spent a few more minutes scrutinizing the bike, noticing the attention to detail and the clever adaptations Theo had worked into the finished machine. Looking straight at his friend, he said, "Once you're sure it's fully ready, and you've got a few shakedown miles under your belt, we'll have to go on a proper adventure together." "I'd like that," Theo murmured.